Now moving forward, let's try to understand the due process handbook of the IFRS. The due process handbook is now going to guide the companies. Suppose if we are trying to bring in a change that will create much more repulsion. So what the IFRS is trying to do here is that it is trying to become a super monitor. Good morning and welcome to the next session, that is on the session 3 of IFRS, and this is a very important session where we are going to speak about the due process in IFRS. Now we have been talking about the International Financial Reporting Standards and how it is becoming a very important part of the accounting standards and how we are following it in and day out. But in this we are going to learn about the IFRS due process and why it is very important when it comes to these standards and benchmarks that they have set across. Now moving forward, let's try to understand the due process handbook of the IFRS sets out the principles that apply to the international accounting standards, which means it is the base at which we are going to look into it, and the IFRS Interpretations Committee followed by the IFRS Taxonomy. Now what I want to share here is that when we talk about a handbook or when we talk about principles, we are talking about the fundamental ideology that is being printed out, that is being talked about in terms of the system. So when we talk about the due process system, we are talking about the basic handbook which has got all the principles, guidelines, values, ethics, and how it needs to be done. So that's why when I'm using this word called as IFRS taxonomy, that's probably the Bible of accounting standards, which is trying to tell each and everybody what is the meaning, what we need to do, how we need to do it. All those factors have been mentioned here. Followed by the due process requirements are built on the following principles. Yes, we are going to look into the principles, that is transparency. Then we are going to talk about the full and fair consultation, followed by the accountability. Now look at the principles of the due process. The first level itself, it's going to talk about transparency. Now that word is very important when it comes to accountancy. If you're not transparent, if you are not open enough to admit the rules and the principles of accounting, then probably nobody would be interested to invest in you, nobody would be interested to believe in you. So the concept of transparency is a very huge concept that needs to be understood very clearly. So that is why in the due process handbook, we make it a point to understand the various aspects of transparency, followed by the full and fair consultation, which means in case there would be any kind of problems or any kind of arguments or any kinds of doubt altogether, there is a full and fair consultation, which means there is an open ideology where we are going to consult, where we are going to help you out in terms of understanding the standards, in terms of telling you where things have gone wrong, how you can correct it, and what do we need to look forward in terms of working together. Because when I talk about consultation, it is not just a one-side review, but consultation here means that when the team sits together, tries to understand the philosophy, tries to understand the entire system, entire setup altogether, we are trying to help each other out. We are trying to understand each other's problem and tell what are the standards that can be adopted for an enhancement in accounting, for a better reporting performer in accounting, followed by the accountability factor, which means at any given point of time, IFRS always mentions this to all its members who are following the standard. It says that you need to be accountable for what you do. Now you cannot go ahead tomorrow and say that, sir, I did not know what happened. How did it happen? Or rather, I would not just come back and tell that it just happened out of the thin air. Rather, you need to tell that you need to hold that responsibility, you need to take that accountability. If there are things going wrong or if the things are being put in the right way, there needs to be an accountability, there needs to be a responsibility taken at each and every level, so that the results that are being predicted, the results that are being given out really matters you a lot. So that's why I say that these factors really matter when I start about transparency, when I start about the full and fair consultation, and then when I go about the accountability. All these factors will definitely matter when we are talking about the accounting process. Now, going forward, the due process handbook, as we were talking about, that is the basic Bible, that is the basic book that is going to guide each and every one when it comes in terms of understanding the accounting standard. The due process handbook is going to describe the requirements of the board interpretations committee relating to the standard setting activities, development of materials that support the consistency of IFRS standard and the IFRS taxonomy. The requirements reflect further due on the process that is laid out in the Constitution. Now, what is very important here from a key takeaway factor is that, as I have told you, the due process handbook is now going to guide the companies, is going to guide the people in telling out what are the factors, what are the considerations that you need to go through by seeing that particular level of work. So, for example, if I am an American company, or I am an UK-based company, or an Indian company, Japanese company, from whichever country I belong to, there are certain standards, there are certain rules, there are certain principles which I need to follow. If I have not followed those standards, if I have not followed those guidelines altogether, then I might have to be questioned back in terms of the operating standards itself. So that is why the due process handbook clearly tells out to the members and to all the people what are all the steps that you need to follow in accounting, what are all the guidelines that need to be prescribed when it comes to the accounting standard. And it also helps in the development of material, bringing in consistency of the IFRS standard altogether, which means to say that tomorrow you will not be in a position just to go ahead and implement any standard, any ethics or principle just like that. It comes up with an amount of factor, it comes up with an amount of matter saying that yes, these are all the standards, these are all the factors under which we have done. So there's a huge amount of research and development that also goes into IFRS in terms of developing the materials, in terms of telling the people how the things are working out. So this is why I say that the IFRS taxonomy is also very, very important, very, very useful for us. So this is how it will be able to move further. You will be able to understand how things are working and how things need to go further in terms of the accounting process. This requirements actually will reflect the further due process that is laid out in the Constitution. So all the processes, all these factors will be tomorrow laid out as a part of these system, as a part of the accounting standard altogether, which has to be reflected, which has to be shown in terms of your accounting enterprise altogether. So that's why I say that this is a very, very important process, rather a key process altogether in terms of making us understand how accounting is important in our day-to-day life. Moving forward, the mission of this entire process is, the mission have a committee that is the DPOC, the due process office committee, that is responsible for overseeing the due process of the board and the operations committee. So what we are going to see here is that we have an interpretations committee, we have a board which is responsible for all this. So there is a standardized committee, standardized team which is going to look into the implementation and which is also going to look into the material and the development altogether. So DPOC is quite a serious committee here, which is laid out with a lot of principles, a lot of ideology, which tries to go ahead and tell people that what we need to do exactly in terms of the accounting standards. Followed by, the DPOC operates in a manner that is timely and enhances rather than hinders the efficient process of the board. Now this is very, very important factor which I would like to talk about in accounting. which is timely and enhances the process. Now, many times in accounting, what happens is that most of the companies, let us take India itself as an example here. In our Indian companies, we have been following certain standards for ages. Now, tomorrow, if the ICAI, that is the Institute of Chartered Accountants in India, come out with a new standard or a new methodology altogether, which has to be implemented in your process, it will not be done in an easy manner. Why? Because there is a lot of resistance to change. There is a lot of resistance in terms of accepting a new methodology. So what happens here is that it will take a long time for you to adjust to the new methodology, tell people that this is the new standard that has to be followed. So in order to avoid this, what happens here is that the DPOC, that is the Due Process Office Committee, comes into the factor saying that whatever has to be done, it will be done in a timely manner, on that particular way, on that particular instant, as soon as possible. And they would also come back and do it in such a manner that it enhances the efficiency and not becomes a barricade altogether. Why it is very, very important here for us to understand is that, suppose if we are trying to bring in a change that will create much more repulsion, that will create much more hindrance, then we are not going to talk about a positive change. But here, the Due Process Committee tries to come out with a change in methodology, in understanding or doing something new, which will in turn try to help the process better, which will in turn make us understand that, yes, by following this or by following that standard, doing that particular activity, automatically the system will get enhanced. It will not try to make a barricade there. It will not try to be a blockage altogether. So that is why the DPOC tries to do things in a very, very timely manner so that it can be automatically understood and accepted. Followed by the timely development of IFRS standard and material to support its application. Now, in accounting, we need to understand that any of this method that is being done or that is going to be carried forward altogether is such an important way, or it's such an important level altogether, that it requires evidence, it requires materials, it requires all these standards which are already drawn, written and published altogether. Now, all of a sudden, you cannot do something just because you believe in your hindsight knowledge that it is available. So what IFRS tries to do here is that it already creates the material on a timely manner. That material is checked, it's reviewed, it's printed, it's put across the board and said clearly that this is what we have come up with the standard, and this development of a particular standard or a particular methodology has to be published, has to be practiced altogether. So what IFRS does is that on one side, the theoretical research, the understanding of the problem, understanding of the case studies, understanding of the situation is done by the R&D team. They come out with materials, they come out with standards, which is again implemented by the DPOC committee, the interpretations committee, and they put it forward for practice. So you can see a right blend of theory and practice coming out from the IFRS team altogether, so that accounting becomes an interesting process altogether. So this is why I would always appreciate the factor that IFRS is definitely standing forward for us in order to become accounting more efficient. Followed by the areas of responsibility. Now, this is very, very important. Why? Because when you are trying to review on a regular basis, you need to understand that you are a part of a committee which is trying to do something betterment of the society. At the same time, you've taken a huge responsibility in terms of making accounting a standardized operation across the globe. So what is the area of responsibility that I'm talking about? The first one is reviewing regularly in a timely manner together with the board, IFRS foundation staff, how it has to be done, and all those factors. factors. It is all about how you are maintaining the standards, how it is being developed, and how things are being done, how consistent are you to the application and factors. All those things are going to be put across, all those things are going to be told across there, followed by reviewing, proposing updates, procedures, so that we ensure that they reflect good practice. Very much, yes, very much mandatory. Why? Because whenever we are talking about this, whenever we are going to review, you're going to propose the updates, or you're going to talk about the good practices that are going on, all these things have to be understood, accepted altogether. So that becomes a very, very important procedure, that becomes a very, very important standard altogether, followed by reviewing the composition of consultative groups in order to have an appropriate balance of perspectives, overseeing the monitoring of the board, the technical staff, effectiveness of the group. So what the IFRS is trying to do here is that it is trying to become a super monitor, trying to go inside, understand what are the various groups doing, what is the consultative practice that they have brought into picture, what kind of ideas, solutions and suggestions that have been passed over to the different committees, to the different teams altogether, and how is the effectiveness of this entire plan working out. So every time the IFRS actually tries to understand what is the picture, what is that exactly going around in terms of doing the work, in terms of understanding the standards, whether it has been implemented properly, whether it has been reviewed properly, is there a regular feedback, is there a regular system that is coming into picture. Now, followed by they also respond to the correspondence from third party about the due process matter, the collaboration of trustee staff, technical staff and all those factors, making the recommendations also in terms of constitutional changes, composition of committees, maintaining the integral process. All those factors are becoming very, very important as an area of responsibility. Now, when I talk about the third parties here, there might be queries, there might be standards which have been raised to the IFRS asking about how a particular incident, how a particular case needs to be handled. So at that point, at that juncture, IFRS takes the moral responsibility of answering back that query, of answering back that factor, saying that yes, these things have to be handled, these things have to be done in the way it has to be suggested. So that is where it becomes very, very important in the collaboration process that, you know, they combine the idea, they combine the theory, they combine the practical factors, and they go back and tell to its members that these are the factors under which we need to work. Plus, in collaboration with trustee and the technical staff, so they also keep their internal members well trained, well informed at any given point of time, followed by if there are any changes to the constitution, if there are any changes to the process, if there are any changes to the system or to the factor altogether, then they will look into the matter in such a manner that unless and until the composition is being completed, the composition has been completely done in terms of bringing in the committees, bringing them to the knowledge of what has happened altogether, they are not going to make the change. So any recommendation, any changes, every single member will be let known, and there will be a high level of integrity that is maintained in terms of prescribing the standards. And plus, they also take into the consideration that if there is going to be any changes that's going to come in, that is going to be done on a collective process and not on an individual basis. So every single opinion will go on a voting basis. They will try to understand how the votes are working, how many people are in favor of it, how many people are against it, what are the consequences that is going to come out of this particular implementation, and then they go in terms of implementing that changes. Moving forward, we talk about the process here. The DPOC will operate through the development of IFRS standard, which is a known factor, the IFRS taxonomy or the IFRC interpretation altogether, including the agenda setting, post-implementation review. Now let us spend a little bit of time in terms of understanding here What they try to do here is that once an IFRS standard is being set, they have to work in tandem to that particular standard only. So which means to say that they will take some time in terms of understanding the development of that particular standard, how it needs to work according to the IFRS need and IFRS query altogether, followed by, based on the taxonomy, based on the interpretation factor, they will have to set the agenda and then they will see the post-implementation review. Now, for example, I have come out with an accounting standard for revenue or for profits or for some loss factor. What they will try to do is that first try to match it across the IFRS standard, see whether it is applicable, acceptable to the companies that are operating in India, in across the globe. And then they will look into the post-implementation review factor altogether. Followed by, this is achieved by a periodic reporting dialogue with the representatives of the board, the interpretations committee, the IFRS foundation staff. So now what happens is that this goes to a level of series of talk altogether. So it will go to the foundation members, it will then go to the staff, it will go to the technical people. So everybody will become a part of this committee. Everybody will become a part of this implementation series altogether. Try to see whether this is effective, acceptable, and can be implemented. Suppose it is not capable enough, we cannot take it into action or consideration. So then they will recommend back to take it away so that that particular thing does not cause a hindrance to the company. But at every stage, the process is followed. That is very, very important. Every IFRS committee is so inbuilt with the process, with the system, that you will not be able to go out of the process, or you will not be able to do things at a random manner altogether. They typically try to bend upon the process in terms of understanding each and every step, how it is implemented, where it is implemented, all the checkpoints, go through a thorough review system, and then finally recommend that this standard might be applicable to the industries. Followed by the communication. Now, how does the communication of this particular act come into picture? Now, that is very, very important for all of us to understand here. Why? Because when I talk about an act, when I talk about a change that has to come into picture, that has to be done with a fair consideration, with a fair understanding altogether. So how is the communication that's going to happen? So first thing is that they will meet in the public, ensuring that the meeting papers, recording of the meeting are made available on IFRS Foundation website. Now, this is typically starting in from the factor called as the minutes of meeting altogether. In the minutes of the meeting, they would go back and tell the people what has happened in the previous meeting, what was discussed, what are the changes that they are trying to bring in, what is the opinion of the committee members. So each and every factor that has happened in the meeting is now going to be revealed publicly on their website. That means to say that this is the full transparency which I am talking about. So their principle, the first principle of transparency, is imbibed in each and every process that we are going to talk about, and that is not going to be new at all. That is definitely there, and they are doing it at each and every standard. So that's what I typically talk about, this factor called as transparency. Followed by updates the trustees on its activities, regularly scheduled trustee meetings and on the ad hoc basis if required. So they are not just going to call for a review or for a meeting just like that. They are going to follow a process, they are going to follow a standard, and then they are going to come into picture. So if there is going to be a meeting, if there's something that is being scheduled according to them, then what they will do is that that meeting will be priorly notified, the members would be called, they would be told what it needs to be done, at what level, at what possibilities, and in case if there is a sudden meeting that needs to be called, a sudden factor that has to be called, then yes, on an ad hoc basis, probably they would conduct a meeting. Followed by, on behalf of trustee, provide updates to the monitoring board. So on behalf of the trustee board, a communication, a notification will go to the monitoring board at a regularly scheduled joint session with the trustee and on an ad hoc basis. Why is this now coming into picture? Is that because you have to tell your stakeholders, your responsible authority holders, saying that this is what we have been been doing, and this is what we are trying to come up with. So this is the factor on which we are talking. So what is happening here is that I am telling out very, very clearly on the factor that these are the levels at which we are working, these are the factors at which we are working, and this is the ad hoc basis on which, suppose if it is required, any meetings are there, we will go forward and we will take it. But then on a regular basis, we will go and tell the monitoring board what has been happening, what are the communications that we have told, what are the new changes that we have brought in. All those factors will be brought in the communication slides altogether. Followed by the communication also tries to report on conclusions, discussions that are found on the website. The report will also include the various matters that are being talked about. What are the technical activities, what are the compliances, what are the new factors to be brought in, all will be recorded and will be put on the website clearly. Followed by it prepares an annual report of its activity for the trustee. Now that is very, very important for any organization. As they come up with their annual report, even the IFRS will have an annual report that is being generated, and that report will be available in the website for the public to view in. Followed by its operating protocol together with document and with any other DPOC governance document. It is always available in the IFRS Foundation website. So what I recommend is that in case whenever you have time, you can just go to the IFRS Foundation website, go through the various meetings, the links, whatever that has been founded, that has been written, so that you come to know what has been happening there. That's the amount of communication, that's the amount of importance that they give in terms of revealing the information to people so that everybody gets acknowledged about what is happening in terms of accounting standards. Followed by the principles here. The principles, as I have told you, their principle is transparency, full and fair consideration, accountability altogether. So the board and its interpretation committee are always towards transparency, followed by the considering the perspectives of the stakeholders. Any problem to any stakeholders, they always look into it. The accountability factors, so they potentially look into the aspects of who is responsible, where it is the matter, how it needs to be taken. All those factors are clearly told. In fact, for the affected parties, they explain the rationale behind why it is like that so that they can set a governing standard. Finally, they also tell them what are the standards that the IFRS is expecting and how they can match up to that particular standard. With this, I come to the conclusion of this session. I hope and believe all the information shared is of a great value and of a great use to you. In the coming sessions, we will be talking about the Indian accounting standards and how the Indian accounting standards has become a very, very effective tool and its approach towards the Companies Act of 2013. So there's a whole lot of exercise that has been going on with IFRS and Indian accounting standards. So this is going to get even more interesting in the coming sessions. So till the next session, please stay tuned, stay blessed, and stay enlightened forever. Thank you once again for joining me on this wonderful session.